Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Psych 313 and the first day of psychedelic drugs. So, today we'll get started in some of the classic psychedelics, basically how they work, how they're organized or categorized, and what psychedelics actually are. So, we'll get some of the basics out of the way in this segment. Okay. So, as a roadmap for today, this is, I guess, obviously the audio version of the slides. I'm giving you an audio annotation. I tried video, but the file got way too big, and apparently it didn't even work on the D2L server, so I'm re-recording it now in audio. Now that I made that announcement, I'll then go into a little bit on the minor adjustments made for COVID-19. And then we'll go back into psychedelics and talk about the background definitions and categories of psychedelic drugs, and then go into the history. So, how were they discovered? How was the active component in some of these drugs figured out? And then what were kind of the social and cultural effects of psychedelic drugs, at least in modern history? All right, then we'll get into some of the drugs. I want to go over 5 general classes of drugs, and we'll cover 2 of them today. The anticholinergics and the serotonergic, more classic psychedelics. The anticholinergics you might have heard about already. We talked about them a little bit. I mentioned the sacred datura flower plant in Tucson. That's one of those. And then the serotonergics are the ones you've heard about probably the most for psychedelic drugs: LSD, mushrooms, DMT, ayahuasca. And then I'll cover a little bit of the history, especially of the serotonergic types as well. All right, then the next class, next week, we'll dive into the 3 other categories of psychedelics. All right, with that out of the way, let's go on. All right, so with regard to COVID-19, as you can now tell, lectures are all online with audio annotations. I'll also try to upload some video files onto YouTube for those for which this doesn't really work very well. It won't quite be as quite high resolution, but yeah. Anyway, it should work fine. It should work good enough. So let me know. Hopefully, it will work for everybody. But if it doesn't, let me know. All right. Yes, as everybody kind of knows, we've missed Tuesday because you were still officially on spring break vacation. So every class has been shifted forward by 1 day. The exams will be converted now into D2L format, and they'll effectively be exactly like they are for the quizzes, the D2L quizzes, multi-choice. You have a limited, in this case, you'll have the same time limit that you have in class during an exam, the same time period. So everything pretty much stays the same, except it's now online. All right. To take precautions against COVID-19, and because pretty much all the undergrads are not allowed to come to class or anywhere on campus, so there's really no in-person office hours. Feel free to contact me or the TAs through email or phone or whatever, and we'll schedule a call or a video conference or something like that. We're definitely open to that. Our schedules are much more free right now than they used to be, so it'll be a little bit easier probably to schedule a time to talk if you have questions, and definitely send me questions too. Since we've gone online now, it's actually we don't have those really great in-class questions that come up. But don't be inhibited, because I'm sure this lectures and the talks on psychedelics will be really interesting to many of you, and you'll have plenty of questions. I've already had some great questions. So please send me your questions through email, and I'll put them together and try to answer them and then send them back to the group. All right. Oh, yeah, and for attendance, yes. Since we're not having in-person classes, we're just giving you guys, as far as the grading goes, free points for all missed, well, all classes from spring break onward. So yeah, you get free points for those. All right. Psychedelics. All right, moving forward to psychedelics. All right, so what is a psychedelic drug? So the word psychedelic, psyche, and delic literally means mind. That's the psyche part. Manifesting, something that a drug that actually makes something manifest in your mind, and that manifestation is typically in the form of some type of hallucination, which could be at the very low end, some distortion of your actual perceptions, or it could go to a full, quote, true hallucination where you see something that isn't there. You hear something that isn't there. You see that, I don't know, purple people eater coming across the street when there is no purple people eater there. And so it's a true, it can kind of go in the range of a slight perceptual hallucination to a full blown imagining of something that isn't there. So psychedelics can do all of the above. All right, psychotomimetic, that's a drug that mimics or causes you to exhibit symptoms of psychosis. For example, one example is schizophrenia. It induces a psychotic state, and that induction in that psychotic state lasts around the same time as the effects of the drugs last. It disappears after the drug is gone, but the word psychotomimetic mimics a psychosis is the word, how the word works. That's the type of that's what that word means, and we'll talk about that a little bit. There's certain drugs like ketamine and PCP that are very strong psychotomimetics. The people taking those drugs exhibit some very similar symptoms temporarily that those that suffer from psychotic illnesses suffer through their whole lives. So that's what the word means. All right, entheogen. An entheogen is a psychoactive substance that causes these alterations in perceptions and moods and helps develop a new spiritual level of awareness, to have no better words for it. But some people who take those drugs to feel more connected, have a bigger spiritual connection or emotional connection with those around you or the world in general. So the term is used to really describe more sacred contexts. Like, for example, ayahuasca is well known for that, where it's taken as a in groups and it's for religious purposes. Peyote is another one, and it's done. People taking the drug are doing it to reach a higher level of awareness. And it's not without cost. Both peyote and ayahuasca has some very negative physical effects. It makes you pretty sick. Stuff comes out. It's not a very pleasant experience. But the overall goal is a big one is to become more connected with the world and this maybe spiritual domain. So that's what entheogen means. And certain drugs, especially some of the old plant-based ones like peyote, with mescaline, and then ayahuasca, which is with the active ingredients DMT, those are entheogens. Entactogens are another type of drug, and they're a drug that has a mixture of the hallucinogenic effects, but also a stimulant effects. It's like you're mixing your cocaine with your LSD. It's like this mixture of the two things. You're getting the stimulation and you're getting the hallucination. That's an entactogen. And tactile means to touch. So that's the word literally means touching within. Empathogens are just like the word sounds. They make you more empathic towards others. You feel more of a connection towards others. A classic example of an empathogen is MDMA, which is ecstasy. People feel more connected with those around you during the effect of the drug. Not to be confused with an empathogen is a sympathomimetic. So this case, sympatho does not come from sympathy. It comes from sympathetic nervous system. And that means it's a drug that activates your sympathetic nervous system, your fight or flight response. Your pupils dilate, you start sweating, your heart's racing. So this is a drug that induces that. And there are many different types of psychedelic drugs, and some are sympathomimetic, some are empathogens, some are entactogens, some are entheogens, some are psychotomimetic, and most of them are some sort of combination of all of those. But it was good to get the definitions at least out of the way. All right, I know probably many of you have questions about psychedelic drugs in general. Try to get those pointed out early on. So many may wonder, what is the legal status of psychedelics? We've seen as a country, we've changed our views a bit on the legal status of marijuana, especially in the last 10 years, at the state level at least. Well, what's the case with psychedelics? Well, most psychedelics and everyone that we'll talk about today in class, they're all Schedule 1, which means it's all deemed by the federal government that they have no medicinal purpose, no purpose for research, and so it's difficult to study such drugs at the federal level. They're making more exceptions now given the new evidence that many psychedelics may indeed have therapeutic uses, but they're still Schedule 1. I mean, there's some exceptions. Ketamine, for example, is not Schedule 1, that's Schedule 3. It's used a lot as an anesthetic. Um, but most of the true psychedelics that we'll talk about, the serotonergic ones, are all Schedule 1. But things just like marijuana are changing. Some interesting news just last year, the cities of Oakland and Denver legalized possession, but not the distribution of some psychedelics. And so they decriminalized basically use of entheogenic plants. I mentioned entheogen before, and that includes the psilocybin or magic mushroom and peyote, which has mescaline in it. But they didn't touch LSD. I think because LSD has too much of an association with, I don't know, the negative side of the 60s. And so LSD was never included in that. But this is a big step for those cities, at least. It's still illegal at a federal level. It's still a felony to possess or distribute, but you will not essentially be put in jail in Oakland or Denver by at least the local police. Um, and so that's the deal. But at the some federal agencies, you in Oakland and Denver, yeah, you could still get in trouble. All right. I just wanted to make a note of this because it's a real interesting side note. Portugal decriminalized all drugs, not just psychedelics, but all drugs, including heroin, everything, in 2000. And it's continued that way now for 20 years, as long as you have less than a 10-day supply. So, yeah, you can't hoard it and be a huge distributor or anything like that, but they decriminalize it. If it's found on you and you have less than 10-day supply, you're not going to be thrown in jail. You're not going to have a crime on your record. And they found that after doing that in these last 20 years, that the drug-related deaths in Portugal just plummeted, and now they're the second lowest in all of Europe, just behind Romania, which blows my mind because Romania we know has some issues with alcohol consumption at least. But it's interesting that Romania and Portugal have very, very low levels of drug-related overdose. Typically, it's overdose deaths. So typically, the deaths are definitely not associated with psychedelics. They're typically associated with the opioid drugs, like heroin, and then, of course, when it's mixed with drugs like fentanyl, those are the drug-related deaths. But since legalizing, those types of deaths have really reduced. On the flip side, though, a negative potentially is that the illegal use of drugs or use of illegal drugs by teens has actually increased a bit in Portugal. So there's the flip side. All right, will taking psychedelics make someone psychotic? And when I say psychotic, meaning more or less permanently psychotic. Will you have a bad trip with your drug, and then will you forever be uh, mentally deranged in some way? And the answer to that is pretty definitively no. That like psychedelics do not make people permanently psychotic. But when you're on the drug, yeah, the answer is yes. You're going to be a little nuts when you're on the drug. You're going to be hallucinating. It has other effects on your emotional states, on your perceptions of reality. So yeah, when the drug is active, yes, it can be a psychotomimetic, as I mentioned the word before. But once it wears off, the psychosis and hallucinations, they go away. And so there's no really solid evidence at all that you can induce a permanent state of psychosis by taking a psychedelic. All right, that's not to say that the repeated use of some psychedelics day in and day out are a good thing. Like ketamine use very, very regularly can lead to memory loss and things like that. But in general, making people psychotic, that doesn't seem to be any evidence for that. Related to this, this is actually from the Julian book. This big U.S. National Survey on Drug Use and Health from 2008 to 2012 found that people who use these serotonergic psychedelics, the ones we'll talk about today, LSD, psilocybin, and mescaline or peyote, those people who took those drugs were not at risk of developing any mental health problems at all. So that again supports at least the classic psychedelics not inducing permanent mental health issues. And in fact, this melds well with recent evidence that some of those serotonin-based drugs might be helpful for treatment-resistant depression. Found that people who had used LSD or psilocybin had lower lifetime rates of suicidal thoughts and attempts. All right. Um, again, this is not to say that it's the best thing ever for everybody. And a lot of people, especially if they're in the wrong context or they're just not ready for the experience, they don't have a really great experience at all with a psychedelic. In fact, more than 10% of subjects report that the experience was negative. They have very negative memories of the experience, period. And sometimes those memories and even the kind of hallucinogenic subjective experiences of it can resurge again later in life, months or even years later, and you can get flashbacks. Some flashbacks are not negative at all; they're just a little trip that you kind of have a year later. But other ones are very negative, and that can happen once in a while as a result of psychedelic use. All right. Will they make you into an addict? Will they make you into a drug addict? All right. The answer to that is generally not, especially the classic psychedelics that we'll talk about a bit today. But there are exceptions. Now, as a general rule, people and animals are far less likely to self administer psychedelics when you compare it to other drugs, especially the drugs we've talked about already. Your nicotine, your alcohol, your cocaine. The use of psychedelics, the classic ones, does not appear to contribute to addiction, in that people rarely have withdrawal when they stop. Regular, like in daily use, is not very common with psychedelics, but there are exceptions, especially when you go beyond those serotonergic psychedelics. For example, the ketamine addiction is a problem, not so much in the US, but it is a problem in the UK and China. It's interesting to speculate as to why it would be a cultural thing, but ketamine does seem to be a problem in the UK and China, ketamine addiction there. And long term ketamine use, as I said before, might not be great for your memory. But it's also interesting that ketamine tends to be a little more addictive than, let's say, your serotonergic psychedelics, in that it doesn't act on the same system. It doesn't act on the serotonin system, but as we've already learned, it acts on the NMDA receptors or the glutamatergic system, and the NMDA receptors are glutamatergic receptors. Now, perhaps more obviously, catecholamine-like psychedelics are also more addictive than the serotonergic ones. Catecholamines include dopamine and norepinephrine, and so it may not be a surprise to you that those types of psychedelics might be a little more, addictive. And MDMA is one of those, but we'll cover that not in this lecture, but next time. All right. So how do we categorize psychedelics? Well, there are many ways to categorize these drugs. You can maybe most obviously categorize them by their chemical structure, but you could also categorize them by their subjective effects on cognition. Do they make you feel out of your body? Do they make you see colors? Do they make you hear sounds or have synesthesia? So there are many ways you can categorize these drugs. The first one that we'll talk about, and perhaps the most relevant for this class, are the categories that are based on the similarity of the active ingredient of these psychedelics to one of the brain's endogenous neurotransmitter systems, its effect on those systems as well. So in that category system, we have 5 groups. We have the psychedelic drugs that block the acetylcholine receptors in the brain, like the muscarinic receptors. These are metabotropic receptors. So these are the anticholinergic psychedelics. So Sacred Datura, as I mentioned earlier, that flowering trumpet-shaped plant is an example of a plant that has a lot of anticholinergic chemicals in it. And the principal chemical that always seems to come up is scopolamine, which is it was a muscarinic acetylcholine receptor blocker. All right, moving on from the anticholinergic, we go to the catecholamine-like, and those are drugs that act on the dopamine and norepinephrine systems and have chemical structures that look a lot like dopamine and norepinephrine. And in that group, you have mescaline, which is peyote, and MDMA, which is ecstasy. Then there are many other ones, as you can see here. I highlighted in the red box the ones that I'll talk about in class, and so those are the ones you should pay more attention to when studying for the exam. All right, moving on. Then we have our classic psychedelics. There are the serotonin-like psychedelics. They look a lot like serotonin. So if you look at psilocin or DMT, which are two classic psychoactive substances that are in the serotonin category, serotonin-like category, they look a lot. If you look at that, look below there, they look a lot. Here we go. I should bring out the pointer. They look a lot like serotonin. So they have the pentamer and hexagonal carbon loops here. And so, yeah, they have a physical shape that looks very similar across categories. So, yes, LSD, DMT, which is in ayahuasca, and psilocybin, which is in the magic mushrooms, they are all in that serotonin-like group. Then moving on, we have the glutamatergic-like, which you've talked about, or I've talked about before. And those are the ones like PCP and ketamine. In high doses, those work really well as anesthetics, general anesthetics. But at moderate doses, you can start to feel out of your body, out of your mind. And so those are also in the general psychedelic grouping. Although there are a subcategory of psychedelics we'll talk about in a moment called dissociatives. All right, and then finally, we have an interesting group because it's really wacko in that it operates in a system that you never would have thought would induce a psychedelic experience, and that are these drugs that are based or activate or similar to the opioid receptors in the brain, and specifically these kappa receptors. So if you might remember that the mu opioid receptor is the one associated with pain reduction and euphoria. Now kappa is more complicated. It's not as clear that it's just simply the pain reduction receptor. And so how salvinorin A, through its action on kappa receptors, or other actions actually induces psychedelic experience is not known, but we know that that is the receptor system it acts upon. All right, moving on. Oh yeah, there's little guy. All right, so that was my reminder that yes, this is the end of part 1. Okay, so again, there are 4 parts, and stay tuned for part 2.